the morning of January 5th, 1943. The sea around the Solomon Islands was restless. The wind carried the smell of salt and burning fuel. Black smoke curled upward, twisting into the gray clouds that hung low above the horizon. On the deck of the cruiser, USS Helena, Lieutenant Red Cochran gripped the cold metal handles of the fire control director. Beneath his feet, the steel heart of the ship vibrated with the rhythm of engines and gunfire. He looked through the optical sight and saw them. 4 Japanese Aichi dive bombers banking in perfect formation, their silver wings glinting like knives in the sunlight. They had just struck the New Zealand cruiser Achilles, and now they were turning away, engines screaming in triumph. The air trembled with their retreat. Cochran did not move. He was watching history happen. Below deck, sailors loaded shells unlike any the world had ever seen. They were ordinary in weight and shape, but hidden inside was something extraordinary, a secret that could sense life through the air. Each shell carried a small brain made of glass, copper, and wire, a device built to know when it was near its prey. No man on that ship, not even Cochran, fully understood what it would do. Cochran's voice came through the intercom, steady but heavy. Target bearing 150. Range 10,000 yards. Fire. The ship answered with thunder. 2 5-inch guns roared from the aft deck, their recoil shaking the ocean. The shells disappeared into the clouds. Seconds passed. Then the sky itself seemed to split open. One of the Japanese aircraft exploded mid-turn, torn apart by invisible shrapnel. It had not been hit. No bullet touched it. The air had simply decided to kill. Cochran stared through his scope in disbelief. The second aircraft began to spiral down, its wings folding like paper before crashing into the waves. The sea hissed where it hit, as if the ocean itself was trying to bury what had just happened. On the deck, the crew fell silent. The noise of the guns still echoed in their ears, but their eyes were locked on the smoke rising from the dying planes. No one cheered. They only stared, realizing that something impossible had occurred. They had witnessed the moment when a shell had thought for itself. That day, the first proximity fuse announced its presence to the Pacific War. To the Japanese pilots, it seemed like black magic. Reports described shells that burst too close, too perfect, as if guided by unseen hands. The air itself had become an enemy. They believed the Americans had created a new kind of radar-guided fire. They were wrong. What destroyed them was not radar. It was a tiny pulse of radio waves trapped inside a spinning shell, waiting to sense the reflection of a target. Below the surface of that success lay years of failure, frustration, and invisible work. Engineers in Washington had been trying to solve a question no one knew how to ask properly: how to make a weapon that could think fast enough to match the speed of an airplane. Before the proximity fuse, every anti-aircraft gun depended on perfect math and human reflexes. The gunner had to estimate the distance, the altitude, the direction, the speed. He had to twist a small dial that set the timer on the shell, hoping it would explode at the right moment. If he guessed wrong, the shell would detonate in an empty sky. If he guessed too late, it would fall back to Earth, still armed, and kill the very people it was meant to protect. During the attack on Pearl Harbor, it happened again and again. American guns fired in panic, their fuses miscalculated, their shells raining back down over Honolulu. Houses burned, families died. 70 civilians were killed not by the Japanese, but by their own defenders. It was the cruel irony of human limitation. The gunner's courage was never enough to defeat the speed of a machine. By the time Cochran fired that first shot in the Solomons, a new equation had replaced those old odds. The fuse no longer needed perfect numbers. It could sense, decide, and detonate on its own. It was the first weapon to carry its own intelligence into battle. When the burning Japanese planes fell into the sea that day, no one on the Helena celebrated. There was no triumph in their faces, only quiet awe. They had seen what science could do, how an idea forged in a laboratory could decide life and death in a second. The young sailors standing by the gun mounts did not feel pride. They felt something colder, something closer to fear. Because deep down, they understood what it meant. The power to kill no longer belonged entirely to them. It had passed into the hands of the machines they served. That night, the sea grew calm. The stars returned. Cochrane wrote his report in silence, his pen moving across the page as if tracing a memory he could not yet explain. "Targets destroyed," he wrote. "Effect extraordinary." He did not know that the words he had just written would mark the beginning of a new age. An age where steel could think and where a fuse could decide who lived and who died. War had entered a new dimension, and no one, not even the men who built it, could fully control what they had unleashed. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor, Oahu. The morning began with sunlight bouncing off calm tropical waters, a stillness that felt almost sacred. Then the sky opened. Japanese aircraft poured out of the clouds like a swarm of hornets, engines screaming, bombs falling through columns of smoke. The air was filled with the deafening rhythm of machine guns and the echo of explosions that shook the island to its core. On the decks of American battleships, men rushed to anti-aircraft guns that had never truly been tested in war. They fought with what they had: steel, training, and hope. But hope could not match physics. The 5-inch guns thundered, their shells rising into the sky with perfect arcs, timed by fragile clockwork fuses that depended entirely on human judgment. A sailor twisted a small wrench, setting the fuse to detonate after a specific number of seconds. If his hands shook, if his timing was off by even a fraction, the shell would burst harmlessly before or after reaching its target. Most of them did. High above, the Japanese planes seemed untouchable. Their silhouettes crossed the sun, their wings glinting as if made of fire. Down below, American shells exploded in empty air, bursts of smoke too early, too late, or too far away. And when they missed, when they failed to find their target, gravity took control. Those same shells, still armed, fell back toward the island. They crashed through rooftops, tore through walls, and exploded among civilians who had run outside to watch the battle. In Honolulu, miles from the harbor, the war reached homes and restaurants and families who had never held a weapon. A shell burst through the window of the Cherry Blossom Cafe during breakfast, killing everyone inside: the owner, his children, the customers. Another landed in a small house, ending the lives of a mother and her 3-month-old baby. By the time the smoke cleared, 68 civilians lay dead. 32 of them had been killed not by Japanese bombs, but by American shells meant to defend them. The tragedy was not only in the loss of life, but in the realization that the very weapons built to protect had turned on their own. It was a brutal arithmetic that no one could ignore. In the days that followed, officers and scientists tried to make sense of what had happened. They looked at the sky, at the wreckage, at the mathematics of anti-aircraft fire. The numbers told a merciless story. To bring down one aircraft, gunners had to fire an average of 2,500 shells. If they were lucky, if the target did not change course, if the fuse worked perfectly. But war was not a laboratory. Nothing was perfect. The sky was smoke and chaos, filled with aircraft moving 300 miles an hour or faster. There was no way for a man with a wrench and a stopwatch to keep up. The problem was not courage, it was time itself. As aircraft evolved, so did their speed and altitude. In 1918, a pilot flew at 90 miles per hour and below 15,000 feet. By 1940, planes screamed through the air at over 400 miles per hour, climbing higher than 30,000 feet. The gap between human reflex and mechanical motion had become unbridgeable. and the sailor standing by the gun mount, his fingers black with grease, was trying to close that gap with nothing more than instinct. Commanders knew the truth. No amount of bravery could compensate for a weapon that was blind. The guns could fire, but they could not see. The men could aim, but they could not predict. The fuse could count seconds, but it could not sense distance, and so the sky remained the domain of the attacker. In Britain, as bombs fell over Dunkirk and London, the Royal Navy faced the same nightmare. Ships fired until their magazines ran dry, but the German dive bombers came again and again. The mathematics of defense had failed. More guns did not help. More ammunition only filled the air with steel and smoke. What they needed was not more firepower, but intelligence inside the weapon itself, a way for the shell to know when it was close enough to kill. The idea sounded impossible. The forces inside an artillery shell were beyond comprehension. When fired, it endured an acceleration 20,000 times the pull of gravity. Even the strongest glass shattered instantly under such pressure. Radios broke, circuits bent. Vacuum tubes, the fragile hearts of every radio and radar set, simply exploded. Engineers laughed at the suggestion that electronics could survive inside a shell. It was madness, they said. The laws of nature would not allow it. But war does not respect the laws of comfort. Somewhere in Washington, D.C., among papers and equations and sleepless nights, a small group of scientists began to dream of the impossible. They believed that even if men could not aim perfectly, the shell itself might be taught to know when it was close. It would need to feel the reflection of its own signal, to sense the echo of an airplane moving through space. It would have to think, if only for a fraction of a second, before it died. That dream would soon lead to one of the most secret projects of the entire war, hidden behind blackout curtains in a quiet building near Silver Spring, Maryland. But before that dream could come to life, the world had to face a terrible truth. Technology had outgrown the men who used it. For the sailor at Pearl Harbor, staring at the empty sky after his last shell burst too far away, that truth was devastating. He had done everything right. He had aimed carefully. He had obeyed every order. And still, he had failed. In his heart, he carried the guilt of shells that fell upon his own city, of civilians who never saw the enemy and still died because of him. It was not his fault, but war rarely distinguishes fault from consequence. That guilt, that helplessness, became the seed of invention. Because sometimes, in the heart of failure, humanity finds its reason to begin again. And from the ashes of Pearl Harbor would rise a weapon so precise, so strange, and so far ahead of its time that even the enemy would think it was impossible. Winter of 1940. Washington, D.C. was a city caught between peace and panic. The headlines still spoke of distant wars, Europe on fire, London under siege. But in the quiet halls of the Carnegie Institution, a man named Merle Anthony Tuve sat beneath a single lamp, his desk covered in equations that no longer fit the page. Outside, snow fell in thin, silent lines. Inside, the hum of a radio played faintly in the background, carrying fragments of Roosevelt's voice, promising that America would be ready. But ready for what? Tuve already knew. He had spent his life studying invisible things. Radio waves, the ionosphere, the pulse of energy that moved through air and silence. Now he was being asked to study something more elusive than any of those. The very space between a shell and its target, the instant before destruction. The letter had come from the National Defense Research Committee. The request was simple and absurd. Build a fuse that could explode when it came near an airplane without touching it. The British had tried and failed. They said it could not be done. The acceleration alone, 20,000 times the pull of gravity, would crush any known electronic device. Even the smallest vacuum tubes shattered under 1/10 of that force. Tuve read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in his desk drawer. He looked at the equations scrawled on his blackboard: reflections, frequencies, Doppler shifts. He understood at once what was being asked of him. It was not just an engineering problem. It was an act of defiance against physics itself. A few weeks later, on a gray morning in August 1940, he gathered a small team in the basement of the Carnegie Institution. They were physicists, radio engineers, and mathematicians, men who had spent their lives working with signals too faint for the human ear to hear. Tuve stood before them and said quietly, "Gentlemen, we are going to make a shell that can see." The room fell silent. The plan was both elegant and impossible. Each shell would carry a tiny radio transmitter that sent out waves as it flew through the air. When those waves struck something solid, an airplane wing, a fuselage, they would bounce back, shifting frequency slightly due to the Doppler effect. If the change in frequency reached a certain threshold, it meant the shell was close enough to kill. The fuse would then send an electrical current to the detonator and trigger the explosion. Simple in theory. Impossible in practice. A 5-inch shell was no gentle host. When fired, it experienced an acceleration so violent that its components would weigh hundreds of times more than their actual mass. Wires snapped, tubes cracked, circuits tore themselves apart before the shell even left the barrel. Every experiment ended in fragments of glass and metal scattered across the test range. Engineers from Western Electric, RCA, and Sylvania shook their heads. They called it the Suicide Project. Tuve refused to give up. He understood what the military men did not, that the limits of a machine were often the limits of imagination. He spent nights rethinking every part of the design. The glass of the vacuum tubes was the first obstacle. Conventional glass broke under stress, so Sylvania's chemists began experimenting with new mixtures, adding trace elements to increase elasticity while keeping the vacuum seal intact. Tubes shrank from 6 inches tall to less than 1. Their electrodes were flattened, their filaments reinforced, their internal structure spot-welded so tightly that it could withstand the shock of a cannon's breath. Weeks turned into months. Hundreds of prototypes failed. Yet each failure taught something new. At night, the lab glowed dimly behind blackout curtains, the smell of hot metal and ozone drifting through the halls. Outside, Washington was darkened for air raid precautions. Inside, the men of Section T worked as if time had stopped. By spring of 1941, something extraordinary began to happen. The first tubes survived the test. Small, ugly, imperfect, but alive. When they were fired from the barrel of a test gun, their filament still burned afterward. Tuve held one in his hand, the glass warm, the filament glowing faintly. It was the size of a child's thumb, and it had survived 20,000 G. He smiled for the first time in months. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "we have life." But survival was only half the problem. The fuse also needed power, a battery that would remain inert until the shell was fired. Any ordinary battery would discharge or explode under such force. That was when 2 scientists from the National Bureau of Standards, Harry Diamond and Wilbur Hinman, conceived something remarkable. They built a glass tube half filled with liquid electrolyte. When the shell rested, the liquid stayed centered and harmless. But when the shell spun through the air, centrifugal force pushed the liquid outward, connecting it with metal plates at each end and generating current. The battery came alive only in flight. It was a weapon that woke only when it was fired. The day they tested it, the men gathered around the bench holding their breath. A small spark jumped. A dial flickered. The current flowed. It worked. It was a strange kind of miracle, one born from physics, not faith. In May 1941, at the Dahlgren Proving Ground in Virginia, 6 prototypes were fitted into bombs and dropped over the bay. They exploded precisely where they were supposed to, sensing the reflection from the water below. 6 out of 6. For a moment, the engineers just stared. The impossible had moved a single step closer to real. Still, artillery shells were far more violent than falling bombs. The acceleration was not hundreds, but tens of thousands of Gs. The team had to design circuits that would not only survive but function perfectly under conditions that bordered on the unimaginable. They needed a transmitter small enough to fit inside an 8-inch space, a receiver that could detect echoes a millionth the strength of its own signal, an amplifier strong enough to boost it, and a trigger precise enough to detonate without delay. Every part had to be smaller, stronger, faster. By mid-1941, their modest lab in Silver Spring had transformed into a fortress of secrecy. Locals thought the men were developing optical instruments. In truth, they were building a brain for a shell. The nights grew longer. Work never stopped. Coffee cups and blueprints filled the benches. Every test carried the same risk, success or shrapnel. When Pearl Harbor was attacked that December, the project changed from urgent to desperate. Tuve received a telegram with only one line: "Accelerate production. The Navy cannot wait." He read it once and said nothing. The time for theory had ended. The time for miracles had begun. Factories across America were ordered to assist. RCA, General Electric, Eastman Kodak, Crossley, entire production lines were redirected. Thousands of workers, mostly women, assembled components they did not understand. They were told it was a new kind of timing device. No one mentioned what it really did. The code name, Variable Time Fuse, VT, was chosen to mislead spies and reassure managers. Only a few dozen people knew the truth. One winter night, as snow drifted outside, Tuve walked alone through the lab. The air smelled faintly of solder and cold coffee. On one bench lay a shell, open at the nose, its small vacuum tubes glimmering in the dim light. He rested his hand on the metal casing and thought of the men who would fire it. Sailors in dark skies, soldiers behind muddy guns, men who would never know his name. He realized then that he was building not a weapon, but a promise. A promise that no child in Honolulu would ever die again from a falling shell meant to protect them. A promise that one day human hands would no longer need to guess. Outside, far across the ocean, the war was devouring cities. But here, in this quiet building, a handful of scientists were fighting a different kind of battle. Not against men, but against the limits of what was thought possible. They were building a fuse that could think. And before long, that fuse would change everything. By the summer of 1941, the war had already redrawn the map of the world. Europe burned from the Channel to the Volga. In Asia, Japan's empire spread like ink across the Pacific. But inside a nondescript building in Silver Spring, Maryland, another kind of front line had taken shape. One where the enemy was not human, but mechanical. Where battles were fought not with guns but with glass, copper, and equations. They called it Section T. Officially, it did not exist. The sign outside the building still bore the name of an old automobile dealership, its windows painted black, its doors guarded day and night. Inside, dozens of engineers and physicists labored beneath the yellow light of desk lamps. There were no uniforms, no parades, no speeches, only the quiet urgency of men who knew the war was coming and that their creation had to be ready before it arrived. Merle Tuve, now officially the chairman of Section T, moved from bench to bench with his sleeves rolled up and his eyes hollow from lack of sleep. He spoke little, but when he did, the room seemed to focus. "We are not building a fuse," he told them. "We are building time itself, time that can see." The work consumed them. Every morning began with the metallic ring of testing rigs and the hiss of vacuum pumps. The air smelled of solder, glass dust, and cold metal. Charts covered the walls, blueprints of circuits, sketches of antennas, notes written in chalk and crossed out in anger. The men had to teach a shell how to think in less than a fraction of a second. The antenna alone nearly broke them. It had to fit within the narrow nose of a 5-inch shell, but still transmit and receive radio waves powerful enough to detect an aircraft hundreds of feet away. After weeks of failed designs, one engineer, a quiet man named Robert Bacher, proposed bending the antenna into a ring that circled the body of the fuse. It was a strange shape, more art than engineering, but when they tested it, it worked. The signal bounced, returned, and triggered the circuit. The shell had listened to its own echo. Slowly, the impossible began to take form. The transmitter operated between 70 and 90 megahertz, strong enough to send a pulse through clouds and metal alike. The receiver, made of 4 miniature vacuum tubes, could amplify signals 1/millionth the strength of what it sent. And when the returning wave shifted in frequency, the telltale whisper of the Doppler effect, the circuit closed and the detonator fired. Each fuse was a symphony of precision, no larger than a milk bottle, yet containing 130 individual parts. Wires thinner than hair, coils wrapped by hand, batteries sealed like secrets. Every mistake meant failure. Every miscalculation could kill. The acceleration inside a naval gun was 20,000 Gs, enough to crush a man into dust. The fuse had to survive it without blinking. To test them, Section T built a firing chamber in the basement, a narrow barrel surrounded by sandbags. When the first prototype was loaded, no one wanted to stand near it. The tension in the room was electric. Tuve counted down softly. 3, 2, 1, fire. The gun spat flame. The building trembled and the lights flickered. For a heartbeat, silence. Then a faint ping. The recovered shell was dented, cracked, but the tubes inside still glowed faintly orange. It had survived. That night they celebrated with burnt coffee and a single bottle of bourbon passed hand to hand. They were too tired to toast, too wired to sleep. The next morning work resumed as if nothing had happened. For every success, 10 failures waited. But the direction was clear now. The impossible was no longer impossible, only unfinished. When the attack on Pearl Harbor came that December, the news hit Section T like a shell itself. Tuve gathered his team in the lab and read the casualty reports aloud. Ships burning, sailors dead, civilians killed by falling shells that had missed their mark. The men listened in silence. The reality they had studied on paper now had faces. That evening, the project's classification was raised to top secret. Funding poured in overnight. What had been a handful of researchers became an army of minds. Factories were converted, contracts signed, and the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory was created to coordinate the work. For the first time, science, industry, and the military moved as one. By the summer of 1942, the first production models were ready for testing. The Navy arranged trials in the Chesapeake Bay. The USS Cleveland was chosen, its decks lined with engineers in heavy coats, their eyes fixed on the horizon. Above, 3 radio-controlled drone aircraft circled like vultures against the gray sky. The order came down. "Commence firing!" The guns barked. The first shell burst a few feet from the target, a perfect air burst. The drone caught fire and fell into the sea. Another burst tore the wing from the second target. The third drone tried to climb, but the next salvo found it anyway. Within minutes, all 3 were gone. The officers on deck stood motionless. One of them turned to Tuve and whispered, "How many rounds did we fire?" 10, Tuve said. Before that day, it had taken 2,500 shells to bring down a single aircraft. Now it took less than 4. The Navy canceled the rest of the 2-day test schedule. They didn't need more proof. Production was ordered immediately. Factories in Ohio, New York, and New Jersey began working around the clock. Crosley, RCA, Eastman Kodak, General Electric. More than 100 companies joined the effort. The goal was 40,000 fuses a day by year's end. Workers were told only that they were building precision instruments for national defense. None of them knew they were assembling the eyes of a new kind of weapon. The secrecy was absolute. Each company made only one part. The assembly lines were divided so that no worker could see the whole. Even the name was designed to deceive. Variable Time Fuse, a harmless phrase to hide a terrible truth. In military dispatches, it was simply called PZT, meaningless letters for a weapon that would change the war. Late one night, after another endless day of tests, Tuve stood outside the lab and looked at the stars. He thought of the sailors at Pearl Harbor, of the families in Honolulu, of the pilots who never saw what killed them. He wondered whether humanity could ever control the power it was unlocking. The proximity fuse was more than a machine. It was the embodiment of a new philosophy, that thinking could be built, that decision could exist inside metal. It was the first step toward weapons that would no longer need men to aim them. As the first crates of fuses rolled out of the factories and onto Navy trucks, Tuve wrote a single line in his notebook, "We have taught steel to feel." Months later, far across the Pacific, those fuses would ignite the sky and turn the Japanese war machine into a storm of fire and disbelief. But that night, in Maryland, the world was still quiet. The men of Section T went home under blackout curtains, unaware that they had already altered the shape of history. They had built a weapon that could think, and soon it would learn to kill. January 5th, 1943. The sea near the Solomon Islands was the color of smoke and salt. Waves rolled slow and heavy against the hull of the cruiser USS Helena as she cut through the gray water in formation with the New Zealand ship Achilles and several American destroyers. The morning was tense, too quiet, the kind of silence that soldiers learn to distrust. Above, the clouds hung low, pregnant with rain and the promise of war. Lieutenant Red Cochran stood inside the fire control director, his headphones pressed tight against his ears. Around him, the air smelled of oil and sweat and the faint metallic tang of gunpowder. Through the glass panels, the horizon shimmered with the haze of heat and distance. Every man aboard knew what might come. Japanese reconnaissance planes had been spotted at dawn. It was only a matter of time before the attack arrived. At 11:37, the alarm klaxon screamed, "Enemy aircraft inbound, bearing 235. The calm sea erupted into movement. Men sprinted to their stations. Shells clanged against steel as loaders swung ammunition up from the magazines. On the horizon, 4 tiny specks appeared, growing larger, their wings catching sunlight. Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, fast, disciplined, and deadly. They came in low, their engines howling like sirens. The sound crawled into the bones of every man on deck. For months the crew had drilled for this moment, but today their guns carried something new. Hidden within a few of those 5-inch shells was a secret none of the sailors fully understood, the proximity fuse. The gunners called them magic shells. The officers said nothing. They were under strict orders. These rounds were to be fired only over open water. If a shell failed to explode, it had to vanish beneath the waves, beyond enemy recovery. Cochran adjusted the controls, his eyes never leaving the oncoming planes. Target, bearing 235, range 10,000 yards. Ready the aft battery. Fire on my mark. Below deck, the gunnery crew braced themselves. The 5-inch barrels glowed faintly from earlier salvos. The loading officer shouted over the roar of engines and machinery, "VT rounds in the breech, ready to fire." Cochran's voice came through the speaker, calm but cold. "Fire!" The guns thundered. 2 salvos leapt from Helena's aft deck, the recoil shaking the entire ship. The shells arced into the sky, invisible to the naked eye. Then, in the span of a heartbeat, the sky changed. A flash. A burst of orange fire near one of the diving planes. No shell had touched it, but the air itself seemed to ignite. The Japanese bomber disintegrated mid-turn, its wings folding backward, fragments spinning like leaves caught in a storm. The explosion's echo rolled across the sea, a low growl that made every man flinch. Seconds later, another plane banked hard to evade, but shrapnel tore through its fuselage. It began to smoke, then plunged nose first into the waves. The water hissed, steam rising where the wreck hit. On the Helena's bridge, silence hung for a full second before the sound returned. The crackle of the radio, the shouts of men, the rhythm of waves slapping against steel. Cochrane lowered his binoculars slowly. His heart was still pounding. He turned to his fire control officer and said only one word: effective. Below deck, the crew stared at one another in disbelief. They had fired the same way they always had, but this time the sky had answered differently. There had been no direct hit, no perfect aim. The shells had simply known when to explode. In that moment, history shifted. The Japanese pilots who survived the engagement reported something they could not explain. They spoke of shells that burst too close, too perfectly, of air that seemed alive. One pilot described it as the sky itself breaking apart. Japanese intelligence officers dismissed the claims at first, assuming it was radar-guided fire. They never imagined that the Americans had found a way to put radar inside the shells themselves. On board the Helena, the excitement was subdued. The sailors were proud but uneasy. There was something uncanny about a weapon that could decide for itself. One gunner, a young man from Ohio, whispered to another, "Feels like we're not the ones doing the fighting anymore." That night, after the smoke cleared, Cochrane wrote in his report, "Targets destroyed. Range approximately 10,000 yards. Fuse performance beyond expectation." He did not realize that he had just documented the first combat kill in history by a proximity fuse. The news spread quickly through the fleet. Messages coded under the phrase PZT success reached naval commands across the Pacific. Within weeks, every major cruiser and battleship was demanding the same ammunition. The Navy had found its invisible ally, a weapon that could think faster than any human, that could make the air itself lethal. In the months that followed, the change was immediate. Engagements that once required thousands of shells now took hundreds. Pilots who once attacked in formation began to scatter, terrified of unseen explosions that tore through their ranks. By March 1943, proximity-fused shells made up only a quarter of the Pacific Fleet's ammunition, but accounted for more than half of all Japanese aircraft destroyed by naval gunfire. It was not luck. It was science. Precise, relentless, merciless. But victory came with its own cost. Some of the men began to feel a strange guilt. They had always known that killing was part of war, but this was different. Before, a gunner aimed, fired, and prayed. Now the weapon itself seemed to carry the burden. "We don't even see them anymore," one sailor wrote in his diary. "Just smoke, fire, and silence. The fuse does all the thinking for us." Still, they could not deny the results. The proximity fuse had transformed anti-aircraft warfare overnight. The Japanese began changing tactics, attacking from higher altitudes, dropping bombs early, or flying low enough for their shadows to blend with the waves. It did not matter. The fuses adapted, sensing reflections from the water or detonating just above the surface. By summer, the Pacific Fleet was different. Ships that had once been targets became fortresses. At night, under radar-guided fire, the sky lit up with perfectly timed bursts. Japanese pilots called it the Wall of Death. And yet, for all its power, the fuse remained unseen, unheard, uncelebrated. Its existence was buried under secrecy. The sailors who fired it did not know who built it. The engineers who built it never saw what it did. It was a quiet miracle of war, one that made killing more efficient and dying more invisible. Lieutenant Cochrane never forgot that day. In later years, when he was asked about the moment he saw the first plane explode, he said nothing for a long time. Then he answered softly, "It was beautiful, and it was terrible, like watching lightning learn your name." In that instant, he understood what every soldier eventually does, that progress and destruction are often the same thing, spoken in different tongues. The proximity fuse did not just change how men fought. It changed how they felt about fighting. It showed that the line between human and machine, between thought and command, was thinner than anyone had ever imagined. And as the war marched on, that line would blur even more, until the sound of thunder became the sound of thinking steel. By the spring of 1943, the Pacific no longer belonged to the Empire of Japan. It still looked that way on the maps. Thousands of miles of ocean marked with red flags and Japanese characters, but the truth was written in the sky. Every week, fewer bombers returned from their missions. Every day, the air over the islands grew quieter, emptier. Something had changed, something invisible. At first, Japanese commanders believed it was a coincidence, bad weather, poor training, fatigue. Then they blamed radar, insisting that the Americans had developed faster fire control systems. But no one could explain the precision. Japanese pilots began reporting shells that seemed to sense them, detonating perfectly even when they changed course or altitude. There was no visible trail, no tracking beam, no sign of guidance. Just a sudden flash in the air, followed by nothing but falling steel and flame. In the ready rooms of Rabaul, pilots smoked in silence. Some muttered about ghost shells. Others swore that American ships were using spiritual weapons, guided by the souls of their dead. One veteran said, "The air itself betrays us now." But it was not ghosts that hunted them. It was mathematics and radio built into the nose of every 5-inch shell. By March, 1 in 4 rounds fired by the American Navy carried a proximity fuse. Yet these accounted for more than half of all Japanese aircraft destroyed by anti-aircraft fire. Each shell cost less than $20 to produce, and each one could destroy a plane worth hundreds of thousands. The efficiency was terrifying. Where before it took 2,000 shells to bring down a single bomber, now it took less than 100. The American fleet had become an engine of precision. The tactical balance shifted almost overnight. Japanese pilots, once feared for their accuracy and discipline, began to change tactics in desperation. They climbed higher, attacking from altitudes beyond 15,000 feet, trading precision for safety. Bombs fell wide. Ships remained untouched. When they tried to descend again for torpedo runs, the proximity fuses met them in swarms of airbursts that shredded wings and engines before they could reach range. At night, under radar control, the effect was even worse. Before the fuse, darkness had been the enemy's ally. Now, it was the Americans' greatest weapon. The shells no longer needed light or sight. They only needed the echo of their own signal. The Japanese called it invisible fire. To the sailors who watched it from below, it was something else entirely. A miracle that looked like a storm of lightning blooming in the clouds. On the bridge of the USS Cleveland, during one engagement, Admiral William Halsey stood watching through binoculars. Around him, the sky pulsed with bursts of orange and white. Planes exploded mid-air like fireflies caught in a net of thunder. He lowered his glasses and said quietly to his staff, "We are changing the nature of war." He was right. The proximity fuse had turned defense into dominance. The Pacific Fleet no longer fought for survival. It hunted. Convoys that once hid behind destroyers now sailed openly under a canopy of protective fire. The Japanese lost control of the night skies first, then the days. Their pilots began to panic. Radio intercepts revealed confusion, disbelief, and fear. Some squadrons refused to attack unless ordered at gunpoint. They knew they would not come back. The Empire tried to adapt. They developed tactics to confuse the fuses, attacking at sea-skimming altitudes where the shells might detonate prematurely by reflecting off the waves. For a few weeks, it worked. Then the Americans adjusted their settings, calibrating fuses to ignore the ocean's echo. Once again, the fire returned. By late 1943, American gunnery officers noticed something new. Japanese attacks no longer came in mass formations. They came in twos and threes, tentative, disorganized, uncertain. It was not strategy, it was despair. The Empire's best pilots were gone, consumed in flames or resting on the ocean floor. Those who remained were children barely trained to take off, much less survive combat. The proximity fuse had accelerated a silent extermination, not of machines, but of experience. In a war measured by numbers, this mattered more than anyone yet realized. Every plane lost was a lesson erased. Every dead pilot was a vanished memory. Meanwhile, American logistics surged. Factory lines in Cincinnati, Rochester, and Schenectady worked without pause. 70,000 proximity fuses rolled off the lines every day. Women in kerchiefs and overalls assembled components smaller than their fingernails, never knowing what they built. Each part was stamped, boxed, and sent across the country to naval depots. By the time the crates reached the Pacific, the contents were already obsolete. Improved designs were waiting behind them. The machine of war had learned to evolve faster than the battlefield itself. In Tokyo, senior officers debated endlessly. Some demanded proof of what the Americans were using. Others dismissed the reports as exaggerations meant to demoralize them. No device could survive gunfire, one engineer said. It is impossible. But the pilots knew. They had seen the impossible burn. In one intercepted message, a Japanese air commander wrote, "Their guns no longer miss. The sky above their ships is cursed." That curse was the sound of science doing what faith could not, protecting men who had once been helpless beneath the sky. On board the ships that fired those shells, there was no celebration. The sailors did not cheer the destruction. They simply watched the smoke rising and reloaded. Many of them had seen Pearl Harbor. They remembered the civilians who had died from their own misfired shells, the guilt that had never left them. Now, at last, they felt that each explosion was not vengeance, but balance, a correction written in fire. Still, the emotion was complicated. Some sailors began to feel haunted by the ease of it all. Killing had become too simple. The enemy no longer had faces, only flashes. The fuse had taken the decision from them. "It feels like we've vanished from our own war," one petty officer wrote in his journal. "The machines fight, and we just watch." By the end of 1943, the Pacific skies were no longer Japanese territory. They were death zones. Every time a pilot climbed into his cockpit, he carried the knowledge that the air itself might turn against him. And as the Empire began to lose control of the heavens, it turned in desperation towards something darker. A weapon that needed no accuracy, no return flight, no survival. That weapon would come with a single word whispered through the corridors of the Japanese Navy: kamikaze. The proximity fuse had broken Japan's sky. In doing so, it had forced its pilots to choose the only certainty left to them: death itself. The air had betrayed them. The future had arrived. October 1944. The sun over the Philippine Sea bled through thin layers of haze, turning the waves into sheets of molten glass. The wind smelled of fuel and fear. On the decks of American carriers, sailors moved like clockwork, rearming planes, checking fire control systems, scanning the sky for the enemy they knew would come, not to fight, but to die. The radio intercepts had warned them for weeks. Japanese pilots were no longer returning from missions. They were crashing deliberately into ships. The reports called them Shinpu Tokubetsu Kogekitai, Divine Wind Special Attack Units. But the sailors simply used one word: kamikaze. No one on the sea was ready for what that meant. At dawn, radar operators aboard the USS Lexington picked up dozens of contacts approaching fast from the west. They were low, below 2,000 feet, where radar lost its edge. The watch officer frowned, adjusting his headset. "They're not climbing," he muttered. "They're diving." Seconds later, the lookouts saw them. Streaks of silver catching the morning light, engines screaming like banshees. "Air attack! Bearing 270. The fleet came alive. Guns rotated, ammunition belts clattered. The sky erupted. The 5-inch batteries barked first, their shells tracing invisible arcs through the humid air. Within those shells spun the quiet genius of Section T, the proximity fuse, the unseen eye. The first kamikaze burst into flame 300 yards short of its target, disintegrating in midair. A second kept coming, its wing shredded but still flying, until another airburst split it apart. The fragments rained down like burning confetti. The sailors cheered, then fell silent as more dots appeared on the horizon. The kamikaze were not like other enemies. They did not turn away. They did not retreat. Even when hit, they kept coming, engines burning, wings torn, eyes fixed on the ship ahead. For the men on deck, it was like watching fire itself try to think. The proximity fuses worked flawlessly, detonating at just the right distance, filling the air with lethal fragments. Yet it was not enough. A few planes, even crippled, still found their marks. One slammed into the carrier St. Lo, turning it into a column of smoke and twisted steel. Another tore into the destroyer bush, killing 40 men. The sailors learned quickly that against an enemy who refused to live, precision was not enough, only total annihilation. They adjusted their tactics. Instead of firing short bursts, they unleashed continuous walls of proximity-fused fire, layering the sky with timed explosions. Each shell created a sphere of shrapnel, and together they formed a storm. During one engagement near Okinawa, the destroyer USS Hadley faced 156 attackers in 90 minutes. Her guns never stopped. The proximity fuses detonated in rapid succession, bursts overlapping in the air like thunderclaps. 12 planes fell before they reached the fleet. Dozens more exploded midair, but 4 kamikaze still struck home, tearing through the deck and superstructure. The Hadley burned, but she did not sink. The fuse had saved her long enough to survive. Nearby, the destroyer escort USS Evans shot down 23 planes before being forced to withdraw, her barrels glowing red, her crew half deaf from the continuous blast of their own salvation. When the smoke cleared, sailors found fragments of the kamikaze scattered across the water, pieces of wings, engines, and flesh. The ocean carried them away without distinction. For the Japanese, the kamikaze was both tactic and confession. It was the last admission that the skies were no longer theirs. Pilots were barely trained, their missions one way. Some were teenagers, their hands trembling as they read farewell letters before takeoff. They were told that death for the emperor would cleanse their family's shame. But in truth, they were being sent against a wall of fire that no human spirit could break. In Tokyo, senior officers argued about the results. Reports showed that out of hundreds of kamikaze sorties, only a fraction struck their targets. Many were destroyed before they could even begin their dives. Yet, for every successful hit, for every ship burning on the sea, Japan broadcast triumph. They showed films of planes crashing into carriers, of rising flames, of heroes ascending to heaven. The truth was darker. The empire was feeding its sons to the machine of its own pride. American commanders, watching from their flagships, felt no triumph. Admiral Halsey, whose task forces bore the brunt of the suicide attacks, later said, "They were brave, but their bravery was wasted." The proximity fuse had turned their sacrifice into statistics. Each burst in the sky was a decision made by a device weighing less than a pound, a tiny glass heart sensing distance, calculating proximity, triggering death. There was no hatred inside it, no judgment, no hesitation, only physics obeyed perfectly. For the men operating the guns, that perfection was both a comfort and a curse. "You stop thinking," one gunner wrote in his diary. You just load, fire, and watch the sky burn. Sometimes you see a plane disintegrate, and for a second, you swear you can see the pilot's scarf floating before it falls. And then you fire again. By the spring of 1945, the proximity fuse was no longer experimental. It was standard. Every 5-inch shell in the fleet carried one. The Japanese pilots still came, but fewer each week. The empire was bleeding itself dry, its youth scattered across the Pacific like ashes. On the USS Helena's sister ships, sailors began to notice something haunting. The attacks came mostly at dusk, when the light was soft, when the sky turned the color of blood and gold. "They choose sunset," one officer said quietly. "Maybe they want to die in beauty." When the last waves of kamikaze broke against the American fleet off Okinawa, the sky was so filled with fire that even the sun seemed to vanish behind it. The fuses detonated automatically, perfectly, mercilessly. The sound was constant, 1,000 small judgments of distance, 1,000 instant deaths. After the battle, as crews washed the decks clean and gathered the remains of their fallen, the gunners stood by their weapons in silence. They had won, but victory felt like exhaustion. The sea was calm again, too calm, the kind of quiet that comes only after something irreversible. They looked out over the water where the enemy had died and wondered if any of them had understood what they were flying into. Not a fleet, not even men, but a machine that could think faster than life itself. The proximity fuse had not only saved ships, it had ended the age of human dominance in combat. The line between man and mechanism was dissolving, replaced by something colder, something infinitely precise. That night, one sailor wrote in his journal, "We fought men who wanted to die. We gave them their wish. But I can't help wondering if the fuse pitied them, because for a moment it always hesitates, like it knows what it's about to do." The proximity fuse had done what it was made to do. It had turned the suicide sky into a storm of logic, and yet, in that logic, there was no mercy. Summer of 1944. The war had turned, but peace was still far away. Across the Pacific, the Japanese Navy was dying in fire. Across Europe, the Allies were clawing their way through the hedgerows of Normandy. The world had become one enormous front line, stretched across oceans and continents. Yet in all that distance, one invisible thread connected every battlefield, a weapon so secret that most soldiers who used it did not even know its name. The proximity fuse had crossed the ocean, and Europe was about to learn what the Pacific already knew, that the air itself could be turned into a weapon. At first, its use on land was forbidden. The fear of capture was too great. The fuse was still a closely guarded secret, and German engineers were known for their skill in reverse engineering. If a single unexploded shell fell into their hands, the entire advantage could vanish overnight. For 3 years, the weapon was confined to the sea. Only the Navy and Marine artillery used it, and even then, every unexploded shell had to sink beneath the waves before the enemy could recover it. But in June 1944, that restriction began to crumble. That month, the first German V-1 flying bombs, unmanned jet-powered missiles, began to scream across the English Channel toward London. They were fast, mechanical, and merciless, their engines coughing like demons as they dove toward the city. Each carried nearly 2,000 pounds of explosives. The British called them buzz bombs. The people of London called them the doodle bugs. They came by the hundreds, then by the thousands. On the first day alone, 120 V-1s were launched. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, but the results were pitiful. The bombs flew low and fast at speeds near 400 miles per hour, their small size making them almost impossible to hit. Every miss meant another neighborhood destroyed, another family buried beneath rubble. Winston Churchill himself summoned the scientists. "Use it," he said. "Whatever it is, use it." And so, for the first time, Proximity fuses were loaded into ground-based anti-aircraft shells. Crates marked Variable Time Type VT arrived under armed guard. The soldiers handling them were told only that they were experimental and must never be allowed to fall into enemy hands. Within days, the results were astonishing. In the first week, the guns equipped with proximity fuses doubled their effectiveness. 1 in 10 V1s was destroyed. By the fourth week, nearly 8 out of 10 were shot down before reaching London. British gunners could hardly believe it. They began calling the new shells the Miracle Eyes. On one day, near the end of the campaign, radar detected 104 incoming V1s. 68 were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire alone. Fighter aircraft brought down 32 more. Only 4 reached the city. For the first time in months, the people of London slept without fear. The proximity fuse had saved a city. Yet, even as it triumphed over the skies of England, another storm was gathering on the continent. In December 1944, under the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the German army launched its final major offensive of the war, the Battle of the Bulge. The attack caught the Allies off guard. Snow fell thick as wool. The sky was white, grounding Allied aircraft. The American soldiers trapped in the forests had no air support, no visibility, and no warning. The German infantry advanced through the trees like ghosts. Colonel George Axelson, commanding the 406th Artillery Group, looked through the fog and made a decision that would change warfare on land forever. The proximity fuse was still prohibited for use over soil. But his men were dying. He gave the order anyway. "Load the VT shells," he said. "Fire for effect." The first rounds screamed into the sky and detonated not on impact, but above the treetops. For a second, there was only silence. Then came the rain of fire. The shells exploded 20 to 50 feet above ground, showering fragments in every direction. The snow turned black with smoke. German soldiers dropped instantly, cut down by invisible blades of steel. Foxholes offered no protection, trenches filled with bodies. In minutes, entire companies were wiped out. 3 days later, General Eisenhower received word of the results. He authorized immediate and unrestricted use of proximity fuses in all ground operations. The effect was devastating. Traditional artillery shells buried themselves in mud or snow before exploding, wasting most of their force. Proximity-fused shells detonated in the air, spreading fragments across areas 50 times larger. Against troops in open ground, they were merciless. The German advance slowed, then stalled, then broke. Survivors spoke of air that exploded around them, of death that came without warning. In one engagement near the Sauer River, General George S. Patton's artillery caught an entire German battalion crossing the ice. He ordered concentrated fire with proximity-fused shells. The results were unspeakable. Over 700 soldiers were killed in minutes. Patton wrote to the War Department that night, his words grim and awed. "The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. When all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare. I am glad we thought of it first." By the spring of 1945, the proximity fuse had become the silent cornerstone of Allied artillery. It was used against aircraft, infantry, even armored columns. At night, the forests of Germany flickered with the glow of distant airbursts, each one a precise calculation of death. German engineers eventually captured thousands of unexploded fuses from an ammunition depot, but when they examined them, they dismissed them as defective time fuses. They simply could not believe that electronics could survive gunfire. The secret remained safe because disbelief is sometimes the best security of all. In March 1945, American bombers equipped with modified VT fuses began using them in the Pacific once again, this time over Iwo Jima. The bombs detonated in the air above Japanese positions, raining destruction over gun emplacements that would have survived traditional strikes. For the Marines storming the beaches below, It was the difference between life and annihilation. By the war's end, more than 22 million proximity fuses had been produced, each containing 130 parts, each a small masterpiece of precision engineering. The cost per unit fell from $700 to just $18 as factories perfected the process. The effort required more than 100 factories and 2,000 suppliers, a web of production that stretched from Ohio to New York, from California to Maryland. When the war finally ended and the smoke cleared over both oceans, the generals made their lists of what had won the war. Radar, the atomic bomb, penicillin, and always in the top 3, the proximity fuse. It had changed everything, not by brute force but by logic, not by numbers but by precision. It had given gunners the ability to think faster than the enemy, to make decisions in milliseconds, to see without seeing. It was proof that intelligence, even mechanical, could save lives as well as take them. And yet, even then, few understood what it truly represented. It was not only a weapon, it was the beginning of a philosophy, that machines could carry judgment, that steel could reason, that the line between invention and conscience was about to blur forever. That line had already been crossed, quietly, invisibly, and irreversibly, somewhere over the skies of England, when a small fuse listened to the echo of its own signal and decided it was close enough to kill. Spring of 1945. The world was ending and beginning at the same time. Across Europe, cities lay in ruins. Across the Pacific, the last islands still burned. In laboratories from Maryland to Los Alamos, the men who had built the weapons of victory now faced the silence that comes after triumph. The silence that asks, "What have we done?" Dr. Merle Anthony Tuve sat at his desk in Washington, the same one where he had first read the letter from the National Defense Research Committee 5 years before. The war was over now. The factories that had once built death by the thousands were shutting down or shifting to peacetime production. Engineers who had once calculated how to make glass survive 20,000 times gravity now returned to designing radios and televisions. The headlines celebrated the bomb, the generals, the surrender. Few mentioned the fuse. Tuve preferred it that way. He had never been interested in fame. To him, the proximity fuse was not a miracle of destruction but a lesson in human persistence, the proof that when the world demanded the impossible, ordinary minds could make it real. He often said that it was not one man's achievement, but thousands. The machinists who cut copper coils, the women who soldered glass tubes at midnight, the factory foremen who worked in silence, not knowing what their parts would do. Each one, Tuve said, had a fingerprint on history. He rarely spoke of his own role. When reporters later asked him what it felt like to create something so powerful, he answered simply, "It felt necessary." But the truth ran deeper. Tuve knew that what he and his team had built was not just a weapon, it was a prophecy. The proximity fuse had proven that intelligence could exist outside of man, that decision could be built into metal, that a machine could act with awareness, however limited. It was the first step on a path that would lead to guided missiles, satellites, computers, and beyond. After the war, when military analysts gathered to rank the technologies that had changed everything, they placed the proximity fuse alongside radar and the atomic bomb. But unlike those, it had no single face, no single explosion to mark its arrival. It worked quietly, invisibly, in the spaces between life and death. In a report to Congress, Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal wrote, "The proximity fuse blazed the trail to Japan. Without it, our ships could not have advanced as swiftly, nor survived as long." Admiral Arleigh Burke, who served with the carrier task forces, said that by 1945, every 5-inch shell in the fleet was fitted with a fuse, and those fuses knocked down planes by the dozens, preventing losses that would have been enormously greater. Winston Churchill himself, speaking in the House of Commons, called it one of the most important scientific developments of the war, second only to radar. But perhaps the most haunting acknowledgement came from the enemy. In post-war interrogations, Japanese officers admitted they had never understood why American anti-aircraft fire had become so deadly. They believed radar had been integrated with guns in some mysterious way. A few engineers speculated about radio-controlled shells, but dismissed the idea as impossible. Electronics cannot survive gunfire, one had said, and so the secret survived, not because of silence, but because of disbelief. In that disbelief lay the strangest irony of all. The fuse's greatest protection had not been its secrecy, but humanity's failure to imagine it. In Japan's military archives, researchers later found drawings and notes from engineers who had tried to create similar devices years earlier. Every attempt had ended with shattered glass, twisted wires, failure. The idea had been right. The faith had not. Tuve's fuse had succeeded because it was born not only from genius, but from organization, from the cooperation of science, industry, and strategy on a scale the world had never seen. It was the first time a nation had built an idea the same way it built an army. That model would define the entire Cold War. The Manhattan Project, the Apollo program, even the birth of the Internet, all followed the same path. A small device meant to save sailors from aerial attack had quietly invented the modern world. In the years that followed, Tuve returned to his work in physics. He rarely mentioned the fuse again. Those who knew him said that he carried a quiet sadness, a weight that only inventors of terrible things understand. Once, a colleague asked him if he ever regretted his work. He paused for a long time before answering. "Regret," he said softly, "no. But I learned that everything powerful carries a shadow. The question is which side we choose to stand on when we build it." That shadow stretched far beyond the war. The hardened electronics that allowed vacuum tubes to survive 20,000 Gs became the foundation for missile guidance systems, radar altimeters, and spacecraft telemetry. The very idea of distributing intelligence into individual units, letting each projectile think for itself, became the blueprint for all future smart munitions. Every guided bomb, every heat-seeking missile, every autonomous drone carries within it a trace of that same philosophy. That a weapon can make a decision before a human can react. The proximity fuse was the first whisper of that future. In its tiny circuits lay the first conversation between man and machine. A question asked in milliseconds, answered with fire. Decades later, historians would call it the thinking fuse, the first true precursor to intelligent warfare. But in 1945, it was simpler. It was the device that had made the impossible possible, the fuse that made the sky itself an ally. Still, for those who had seen it in action, it remained something more human than mechanical. Sailors who had served on the Helena, the Cleveland, the Hadley, and countless other ships remembered not the science, but the sound. That heartbeat of distant explosions that meant they were safe. They remembered the nights when the horizon burned like dawn, and the days when silence followed victory. And when they looked back, many wondered what had been gained and what had been lost. Because the proximity fuse, for all its brilliance, carried within it a warning that few understood at the time. That once intelligence leaves the human hand and enters the weapon itself, it never truly returns. It was a warning, written not in words, but in echoes. In the faint radio pulse of a fuse spinning through the air, listening for a reflection deciding in a fraction of a second to end a life. It was the ghost in the machine, whispering of what was to come. The war had ended. The guns were silent. Across the Pacific, ships floated in still water that smelled of oil and victory. Across Europe, children played in streets where the walls still bore the scars of shells that had not yet crumbled to dust. The proximity fuse had done its work and disappeared, absorbed into history like a whisper beneath thunder. But its story did not end when the last shot was fired. It lived on, hidden inside every new weapon that followed, every equation that sought perfection in destruction, every mind that wondered whether intelligence could exist without mercy. In the years that followed, the world built faster planes, stronger missiles, smarter machines. And in each, there was something of the proximity fuse, the logic of awareness, the confidence of precision, the cold efficiency of self-detonation. The idea that had begun with a scientist's impossible dream in a quiet Washington laboratory had become the foundation of an entire age. It was no longer about shells sensing airplanes. It was about machines sensing everything. Guided missiles could now track heat. Satellites could see from orbit. Computers could decide faster than generals. The line between calculation and judgment, once so sacred, blurred a little more with every invention. Dr. Merrill Tuve watched this evolution from afar. He had returned to the quiet world of research, teaching, and reflection, rarely speaking of his wartime work. When pressed, he would say only, "It was necessary at the time." But sometimes, late at night, he would stand alone in the hallway outside his old lab, the one that had once smelled of metal and ozone, and listen to the silence that followed invention. He understood something the world was still learning, that intelligence, once given to a machine, could never be fully reclaimed by its makers. The proximity fuse had taught him that. It had been a teacher disguised as a weapon. It taught that precision is not the same as wisdom, that invention and intention are not always aligned, that when men build tools to see and decide, they are also building mirrors that reflect who they truly are. In the Pacific, sailors still spoke of the fuse with reverence. They remembered the day when the air itself had become their ally, when the invisible saved them from certain death. They remembered how it felt to load those small shells, to trust that the unseen would work, to survive because a circuit had chosen the right moment to end another man's life. Some carried pride, others carried unease. One gunner, years later, wrote in a letter to his son, "We were told those shells could think. I sometimes wonder what they thought of us." It was an honest question, one that science could never answer, because even as humanity celebrated the victory that technology had brought, it also began to realize that the power to perfect killing comes with a terrible inheritance, the gradual fading of human presence from the act itself. Before the proximity fuse, a gunner saw his target aimed and pulled the trigger. He bore the weight of the decision. After the fuse, that decision belonged to a mechanism that acted faster than thought. It was progress, yes, but it was also the beginning of distance, between the maker and the consequence, between thought and empathy. War would never again be purely human, and that was its quiet tragedy. As nations entered the Cold War, Tuve's invention echoed in new forms: missiles that could find cities by heat, bombs that could measure their own altitude, computers that could chart trajectories without human hands. Each step brought more safety for some and more danger for others. Each step whispered the same truth, that knowledge is never neutral. Standing before a group of students years later, Tuve was asked whether he believed his invention had been worth it. He looked at the young faces in the lecture hall, faces born after the war, faces that would never know the sound of the sky exploding, and he said, "It is not for me to say. The world we built is yours to understand. Just remember this. Every invention carries the shape of its maker's soul. Choose wisely what you give to the world, because one day it may decide for you." Outside, rain fell against the windows, soft and unending, like the echo of distant artillery fading into time. The proximity fuse remains, even now, a symbol of contradiction. It saved thousands of lives by perfecting the art of taking them. It shortened the war, but lengthened the shadow of what came after. It proved that science can protect, but it also warned that science alone cannot guide. Some say it was a triumph of engineering. Others say it was the moment when the machine first learned to act without waiting for the human hand. Both are true. And perhaps that is the final lesson, that history's greatest inventions are never only about what they do, but about what they reveal. When the USS Helena's guns thundered that day in 1943, and the first Japanese plane exploded without being touched, the world witnessed more than a victory. It witnessed the birth of a new kind of consciousness, not human, but born of human ambition capable of choice, stripped of mercy, devoted to precision. That spark still burns inside every device that thinks for us, every system that decides faster than we can. It is the whisper of Merle Tuvey's fuse, still spinning somewhere in the air, searching, measuring, sensing, waiting for the perfect moment. And if there is meaning to be found in all of it, in the physics, the fear, the brilliance, and the silence, perhaps it is this: that the truest test of our intelligence is not how well we can make a machine think, but how deeply we can remember what it means to feel. Because the fuse that could think taught the world something greater, that even in war, the power to destroy must never outgrow the power to understand. And that, above all, is the human equation,